to all sorts of things, plus the global anti-apartheid movement. They played a very, very important role there. So, and it wouldn't matter, people might have come originally from Ireland or whatever else, but the Christian church, and more broadly, the religious communities in South Africa were very central in terms of the mobilization of the population to oppose the apartheid system.
And you're coming from a very left family background. You're coming from presumably something of an anti-clerical emergence, or at least an anti-clerical family. How do you see that?
What do we do in the interim? What are some of the quicker interventions that one can begin thinking about so we can get there a little bit faster? The concern, perhaps by many, is that if we wait 50 years for that to happen, we're going to be having the same conversation in 50 years' time.
See, that's what makes this subject a very complicated one. In actual
anti-clerical, because
50 years already, here we are discussing this. Because
South African population, whether communists, priests, capitalists, who share this common thing, that we've got a system here of white minority rule, which is impacting negatively on all our lives. Whether you are a priest or a communist or whatever, and it's in our interest that we act together to get rid of this thing.
So this is a grand alliance?
Oh, absolutely, and it cohered. So you would never find a member of the Communist Party saying, I'm not going to attend this meeting because there's a bishop who's going to speak. No.
I'd like to cross that Rubicon of 1994 and move from the independence struggle into a black governing free South Africa. I was thinking over the week as to that transition when independence leaders now rule an independent country, and I was actually struck by an Irish language poem. And that poem is by an Irish language poet called Kathleen Maud. She wrote in 1963, this poem is called Trowel, which is an Irish word for rage or anger. And it starts off, Tuardam Cossar na tua go mrishigus go millig an chaksha, which is Irish for hand me a hammer or an axe that I can tear down this house, referring to that process of revolution. And then at the end of the poem, she says, hand me the nails and allow me to build up a new house. But she says, but I'm so tired now. Did you feel that sense of one liberation movement being an appropriate leadership to take over the role of governance? And is leading an independence struggle one thing, but leading a government a very different thing?
Yeah, of course it is, yeah.
How did you rise to that challenge?
Well, you know, in a way, what needed to happen once the struggle to remove this white minority regime was won, the situation in South Africa actually more or less dictated what needed to happen. Because here, okay, the apartheid regime is gone, you've got a democratically elected government, and the ANC is the majority party. But what kind of society have you inherited? You've inherited a society where you got these racial divisions. But you want to build a non-racial society out of these various black and white segments of the population. What do you do about that? The history of colonization, 350 years of colonialism, apartheid and all that, has produced these inequalities in society, which unfortunately are also defined in racial terms. How do you address that? You've got a situation where the apartheid system deliberately, consciously, went out of its way to ensure that your black population is as little educated as is possible, deliberately, consciously. What is it that you do to impact on the education and skills and all of that. So I'm saying this the situation itself, in a sense, dictated what needed to happen. So indeed, of course, the ANC sits down and says, what do we want to make of this democratic power in terms of the transformation of South Africa from this apartheid society to this new non-racial, non-sexist society. So, I mean, it's a much more challenging job. The
education.
non-racial, non-sexist South Africa, all of these education questions we are talking about, the economy, etc., they are all interlinked. So this is part of the challenge of the transformation of South Africa after empire. There isn't anything which is not urgent. So you can't say, for this month or year, let's focus on this thing. We'll come back to other things later. You can't, because of the interlinkages among these things. So you got to do something about the economy. You know, we inherit an economy that was in decline, in all respects. So we had to change the direction so that you have a growing and a developing economy and so on with its consequences. So you've got to do that. Among other things, you've got this massive black population without any safety net. That was part of the apartheid system, of the racism. But we've now got a democratically elected government. It can't ignore the fact that there's so many people who are poor.
How did you address that on a practical level?
So, I mean, what part of what had to be done, which was done, was indeed to create a safety net. To say that fundamentally, in the end, to eradicate the problem of poverty means creating of jobs and all of that. Proper pay levels and so on. But in the meantime, that takes time to rebuild an economy that produces that kind of outcome. But in the meantime, there are people who are desperately poor. So there has to be some, as I'm saying, a safety net, so that people at least don't fall below this. So indeed, we then introduced, South Africa still runs that now, a very extensive social security system. I think now, I can't remember what the numbers are, 12 million more people who get one grant of one kind or another, because you just couldn't allow this extreme poverty. But those things you had to do. But again, you can only do that if the economy is producing the necessary resources to enable you to do that. So I'm saying that you are addressing the poverty thing on the basis of this economic intervention. And as you do that, you are also addressing this matter about inequality, black and white. Yes. To bring up these very, very poor black people, bring them a little bit up so that to some extent they catch up with the rest and so on. So I'm saying that we had to move on all of this.
Speaking of the economy, I'd also like to move on to foreign relations. And South Africa went to become a member of G20, and you yourself attended G20 summits. Which of the particular international organisations or international groups that South Africa is now a part of, the Commonwealth, the African Union, G20, do you see as being the most important for South Africans' international relations?
Well, I mean, the first important one is the African Union.
Okay. And you were instrumental of changing that from the Organisation of African Unity
Sure.
into the African Union.
So we're certainly very much involved in that process. That's the first one. It's because the cohesion on the African continent is very important in terms of all of the member countries, including South Africa. The capacity, the ability to act together and cooperate within the continent, but also to be able to represent the interests of the continent vis-à-vis the rest of the world. It's a critical organization, that one. Of course, I would say that the next important one would be the United Nations. Okay. From our point of view, because here is the one truly inclusive, multilateral, intergovernmental, interstate organization, the UN. And it's this one body, if it was functioning properly, which would enable smaller countries, like the various African countries, to be able to play a proper role in the world. If, you know, everybody says the rule of law is very important. Agreed. If you take the Security Council is bound by what is contained in the UN Charter. And that UN Charter will say that Security Council can intervene in whatever country to protect international peace and security. That's the law. Yes, yes. But you see the many instances when the Security Council intervenes in countries with nothing to do with international peace and security, but because you've got some powerful countries in the UN, which then, as it were, they write their own law. That can't be right. Because if we all say, let's all respect the rule of law, including the rule of international law, then that protects the interest of the smaller countries. So I'm saying that the UN becomes very important from that point of view for us. But of course, there are the more directly developmental things, like the G20. Yes. Before that, we had built a very good working relationship between the African continent and the G8. Yes. To get the G8 to support the development programs of the African continent as defined by the Africans. And they had agreed to that. But in the end, that got overtaken by the G20.
In terms of South Africa's sphere of influence and your neighbours, in some senses you've been criticised quite heavily for the role you played with quiet diplomacy with Robert Mugabe and with Zimbabwe. Do you look back on that differently now, or do you think it was important that you left a door open for a country that was going in a very dangerous direction in the early part of this century?
Well, you know, we always were somewhat puzzled by this notion of quiet diplomacy, because there's no other diplomacy except quiet diplomacy. I mean,
well, I suppose loudhailer diplomacy is the opposite.
Then it's not diplomacy.
Yeah,
If you start campaigning there with loudhailers, that's something else. No, the critical matter with regard to Zimbabwe is the matter that we insisted upon, and I'm sure we'd continue to insist on it, is that we've got to respect the right of the people of Zimbabwe to decide their future. That it was not for South Africa to impose on the Zimbabwe people, or anybody for that matter, anybody to impose some solution on the people of Zimbabwe. You know, one of our sharpest differences about this matter was with the British government. Yes. Under the Prime Minister Tony Blair. Because the British government were saying to us directly, we've got to look for ways and means physically to remove Robert Mugabe and put somebody else in the place. And we would say, it's not your duty, it's not your responsibility. This regime change thing. Yes. Who gives you the right to determine who should be the regime of Zimbabwe? That's for the Zimbabwe people. What we have to do is to make sure that we encourage all the Zimbabweans to get together and sit and seriously consider, as happened with regard to Northern Ireland, sit seriously among themselves and consider what happens with their country. That's what's got to happen. And we insisted on this. Yes. And this is what was called quiet diplomacy. But we would always take a position like that. That we have South Africa doesn't have a right to say we don't like the government of such and such a country, and for which reason we'll make sure that they go and we'll put in place such and such a solution. We don't.
I can appreciate your point on self-determination and not interfering in the sovereign concerns of a neighbour. However, do you think that, what would you say to your detractors who say that you legitimise the rule of Robert Mugabe and particularly some of his most unpalatable and deeply questionable policies that were being carried out?
Well, I would say people must demonstrate that, instead of making general statements. You see, for instance, around maybe 2001 or thereabouts, the opposition party in Zimbabwe, the Movement for Democratic Change, they approached us, the South African government, and said, can you please help? We want certain amendments to the Zimbabwe Constitution. We want certain amendments to the Zimbabwe Constitution. Can you please talk to the ruling party and the government of Zimbabwe to do that? So we said, fine, which we did. And you would recall that there had been a constitutional referendum in Zimbabwe in 2000, which the ruling party lost. So when we talked to them to say, look, your opposition are saying they want these amendments to the Constitution, they said, but many of these things that they want are in the Constitution which they rejected. But anyways, that's when the engagement between the Zimbabweans, the opposition and the ruling party started. None of them, I'm talking about elected representatives of the people of Zimbabwe, none of them ever said to us, please intervene to overthrow a government. Okay. What they said, please help us to get together and...
So you see your role as being a facilitator rather than...
Which we did. You see,
a regime changer.
I'm saying that if you take, for instance, 2008 election in Zimbabwe, the parliamentary election, yes, which everybody accepted was free and fair and so on. That's the election where the Morgan Tsvangirai's faction of the MDC got the highest number of seats. It didn't get an overall majority, but it was the biggest party in that parliament. And everybody accepted that thing, which is the result of which, that's why you have a government of national unity. Because you had three parties, none of which had an absolute majority. So they decided the best thing to do, let's form this government of national unity and so on. So, but I'm saying all of them, those parties, all they said to us, please help us to get together as Zimbabweans to decide our future. And then somebody from very far away says, no, you must have removed this. Why? On whose authority? It is Zimbabweans, I'm saying. Even the opposition in Zimbabwe never ever said to us, please help us to get rid of Mugabe.
Do you think the fact that you stepped down peacefully, that you set up COPE as a new political party, is that a testament to South Africa's political maturity now in the early years of the 21st century?
No, I don't know. Maybe maybe it did. I don't know. But it's. I would have considered it to be. It would have been natural in terms of the ANC. Because, as I say, we grow up in the ANC. So the value system that you carry in your head, it comes from there. So in this you can speak about. That's part of what it was supposed to do. So that we sit as peers to say, no, but the president, you are misbehaving. You are stealing public resources. You've accessed power in order to put money in your pocket. This is not the leadership we want. But we're not doing that sufficiently because we're afraid. We're afraid to speak frankly to one another about the wrong things that we're doing. And I think if we don't do that, we will meet a century hence to discuss the same question. I think that critical self-assessment of the continent is necessary. And I mean a real, critical, truthful self-assessment. That's critical, and I think that would be an important step forward in terms of producing this kind of leadership which Africa wants. I'm handing this to President Kapp.
I suspected you might do that, yes.
What a cruel gesture, Thabo. We want an Africa, as you said, where there is equality of gender, equality of opportunity, promise of a good, healthy life, promise of an educated society, promise of a leadership that thinks more about service than being served. We want all of that, borders to be removed and so on. Why don't we have it? My answer is very clear. Because you have a selfish leadership. Extremely selfish. We often think of the problem of leadership as being the problem of the leaders alone. Fine. They must be defined, have integrity, have all those we want. But to succeed, they must be able to implant those attributes in the population. Their political parties must be organized in such a way that they reflect those values and embody those aspirations in their political interaction. If they don't, you have trouble. We are multi-ethnic societies. What basic values have we embodied in these societies? Equality? Or is it diversity? How do you convert diversity into strength rather than diversity as a cause for war and internecine fighting? Can it be done? It can be done. It's been done in centuries before, in Europe and elsewhere. Why can't it be done in Africa? But we don't have the will because we are selfish. We are concerned of the here and now in the seat I am in. That's wrong. We have, it's ironical that you have a continent with the best natural resources of any others as of today, but they are being exploited for the sustenance of those who enslaved us and continue exploiting us rather than being exploited for our own emancipation. Why? Because you have a leadership that does not recognize the degree of present-day enslavement, economic enslavement, and the necessity for emancipation. It's ironical. We talk about development, but we don't stop in time to define what development in our kind of situation is. One of the greatest reasons of admiration for this country, for instance, is the fact that you have here a universal system of health and education delivery. Now that is development. Rwanda is more developed than any of these Western countries in this regard, where you have assured health and education delivery. So we really must rethink where we are, why we are, what we can be, and how we can. I agree, women, youth, and all those things. But internally, the fault is in us, dear Brutus, not in our stars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can have people, I'm going to go to the floor. If people can please raise your hands. If you have a question, I ask that you please be clear about whom you're directing it to, first off, and then also introduce yourself and the organization that you represent, so at least we have a sense of whom we're speaking to. Madame, if I can ask you to give that lady the microphone. Do we have another microphone on this side? Do we only have the one microphone? Okay.
So, good afternoon. Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. We have at least 4 presidents on the panel. It's very difficult for outstanding leaders of any organisation to think about their succession. My question to the 4 presidents is, what do each of you think are the most important steps you need to take in order to ensure that your succession is a positive and smooth one? Thank you.
Can I take a bit of an executive decision on this and direct it to President Kagame and to Deputy President Ruto so we can get as many interactions as possible? I know I'm editing your request, but I'm sure you'll indulge me. If I can go with you first, President Kagame.
I think to give more value to the question and the meaning of it, it is important to think about what you leave behind for the successor to take over than even to just be succeeded. What I am saying is, you see, the issue of succession, very important it is. But people have reduced it to an end in itself, to the point that even if you were in power and did nothing, as long as you are succeeded, that is very good. So I think we should combine the two. So for me, I'm thinking beyond being succeeded. I'm actually thinking about what do you leave behind when a successor comes. So otherwise, it could be in power for 10 years, for 20, mess it up, and then say bye-bye, and somebody else comes, takes over, and just screws up the same way as the other one. And that's, by the way, that's also one reason why some of the problems in Africa are there as we see them. We have had places where this succession has been going on quite well, but the lives of the citizens have not changed, or they even get worse. So I think it is better to take it holistically and look at the meaning of it. So I think my preoccupation as a leader is to do the best I can while I am there. So that, because what we are managing is just not succession, it is the lives of people. And in fact, you see, the other thing about leaders, yesterday somebody raised the point, he talked about strong leaders and said we shouldn't talk about that, we should be talking about institutions. And I think Thabo Mbeki raised a good point. Even for strong institutions, or institutions that deliver for people, actually don't just happen. They are put in place by people, by leaders. So leaders we want, and therefore who should be succeeded and things go on, as one aspect of what many things that should happen, should be leaders that allow the building of institutions that will outlive them. But it is leaders who will still do it, especially when they work well with their people.
So looking at the fact, if I may, before I come to you, Deputy President, looking at the question of institutions and recognizing that one does need strong institutions that allow us to continue to develop. The reality, and we've seen it happen time and time again, that the successor goes about very quickly dismantling said institutions, said support, so you find yourself back at square one within a decade.
Yes, sure.
So is it about the leadership? Is it about the strong institutions? Is it about a broader recognition that there needs to be...
It's about a combination. Mm-hmm. But you're addressing it to me or somebody else?
No, to you. I just was gesturing to him.
It's about a combination.
Yes.
Yes, it's not one thing or the other alone. It's a combination of things. It's about leadership that gets things right. It's about, and getting things right as leaders includes creating institutions. Institutions that serve the societies as they are, and not just being locked onto one individual and thinking that is the end of the problem. So it is a combination, there's no doubt. Sometimes you don't know which comes first. It almost looks like a chicken and egg puzzle, but both, or beyond more than both, are very important.
Mr. Deputy President. Vice President.
Strangely, this morning, when I left Nairobi, I got an SMS on my phone. Maybe I'll go and check and maybe call that gentleman back. Because the SMS went like this. Mr. Deputy President, my grandfather was a squatter. My father was a squatter. I am a squatter. And my son is likely to be a squatter. What are you going to do about it? This morning. And I think it speaks volumes to the succession you have alluded to. In this sense, as leaders, what kind of continent or nations would we want to hand over to our successors or to the next generation? I think really that is where the bottom line is. And I would dare say that as leaders, it must bother us, and seriously so, that the continent we have inherited,
A disease or can be sexually transmitted.
Sure, I have no problem with that.
Well, then could simple policies like the promotion of condoms and physical contraceptives be a useful way to stop the spread of this disease?
You need it also, a problem in South Africa, issues of teenage pregnancies. The condoms and all this are very important. If you look at the health profile, if you want to discuss the health profile of the South African population, you wouldn't start where you started.
Okay.
You would say, what is the biggest killer in South Africa? Even today. The last report of the Statistical Authority, which it covered the year 2013, it puts the deaths from HIV as number 3. From the original number 9, there are 3. There are questions that arise about that.
What questions are they?
The questions are from 2008, 2009. The public health system has provided all of the antiretroviral drugs that you need. That's why nobody makes any noise about it, because the current government has responded like that. The problem, I'm saying, is that in the midst of that, as a killer, this rises from number 9 to number 3. Why?
Well, what do you think?
I don't know. But that's a question that needs to be discussed. Because the response that was expected, let's flood the country with antiretroviral drugs. This is the consequence. The opposite, let me say the opposite. What's happened practically, the absolute number of people who are dying from what is classified as HIV disease has increased. And as a proportion of deaths, it's increased. So somebody needs to ask the question, why?
Why does the South African government not look at some of the less glamorous but probably more fundamental work, like working on public drinking water rather than working on antimicrobial resistance? Would they be more important public policies on health and public sanitation to carry out, even if they're less glamorous? But is that being pursued in South Africa today?
But those things are being done.
But not at the rate they could be done. And for instance, there is a lot of money being pumped into things like antimicrobial resistance in South African scientific research, where when you don't have a clean public drinking water system for everybody, is that really the top priority?
I mean, the issue about clean water and access of water by all communities, all families, it's an old program. As soon as we came into government, and I don't think that...
and it's still not over, though.
Sure, I mean, sure, it's not as though you say one day everything is concluded. The population grows, new communities emerge, and all that. But I don't think it's the thing about clean water is a major issue of debate. The issue of sanitation, also, that's a bigger matter of debate. That sanitation issue, because the supply of clean water, the sanitation bit, has been quite important with the supply. So that's a matter that is open discussion. But clean water is very important in terms of health. Naturally, questions of nutrition. What kind of nutrition do people have access to? Is it healthy? Is it adequate? All of this. So all of these things you've got to attend to as you attend to the human body. But I'm saying, coming back to the health thing, it's really, if there is time, we would have to look at this properly, say, look, South Africa produces its health sector. One of the few countries on the African continent that actually has got superior that is not estimated. Here are the statistics. Now let's look at these things. Why, if you look for instance, this case I'm talking about, when we said the report on mortality and causes, they break it down by